The arena trembled like it might split apart. 50,000 voices surged together in a tidal wave of sound, shaking the steel beams overhead and rattling the glass of the corporate boxes. The floor itself seemed alive, quivering under the weight of stamping feet, clapping hands, and chants that rolled like thunder. Michael, Michael, Michael. It wasn't just noise. It was a force, a living organism with a heartbeat of its own. And at the center of it all, suspended in a single piercing spotlight, stood Michael Jackson. His sequined jacket glittered like shattered stars. The fedora angled low over his face cast him in mystery. Every tilt of his head a calculated gesture that sent fresh screams rippling through the crowd. His white glove caught the light and turned into a beacon. Every flick of his wrist igniting a frenzy of arms reaching up from the pit below. He hadn't moved yet, not really. Just standing there, still as stone, was enough to make the arena quake. The opening chords of Man in the Mirror began to flow from the band behind him, a song unlike the high-energy anthems and fierce dance numbers he'd already delivered that night. This one was quieter, personal, a song that stripped away spectacle and forced thousands to look inward. And Michael, stepping toward the microphone at center stage, was ready to lead them there. The crowd hushed, sensing the shift. Smoke curled around his ankles, soft white fog rolling like a tide across the stage. The screen above magnified his every move, the shadow beneath his hat brim, the slight tremor in his lips before he parted them. His voice slipped into the first line, smooth, gentle, almost conversational. I'm going to make a change for once in my life. The sound carried effortlessly, pouring through the speakers with a richness that only Michael possessed. A ripple of emotion spread through the audience. Fans held their breath. Some lifted their hands in worship. Others swayed, tears already starting to sting their eyes. This was why they had come. Not just to see the moonwalk, not just to scream at the glitter, but for this, for the soul behind the pop star. Michael moved slowly, his body flowing with the rhythm, every step deliberate. His gloved hand reached outward, as though inviting the entire arena to walk with him. It's going to feel real good, going to make a difference, going to make it right. The cameras panned the audience. A sea of faces, young and old, swaying together, caught in the trance of his presence. A mother clutched her daughter. Teenagers clung to their friends. Grown men, too proud to cry in any other context, wiped at their cheeks. This was communion. This was church. This was Michael. The band swelled as the chorus approached, and Michael's voice rose above them all, strong, clear, shaking the rafters. I'm started with a Man in the Mirror. The crowd erupted, voices joining in unison. Thousands of people singing back at him, transformed into a single choir. The energy lifted, soared, became something more than entertainment. Until it happened. A voice. Small, high, thin against the thunder, but piercing, desperate, and impossibly clear. Michael. It cut through the music, like a blade through silk. Michael's body froze mid-gesture, the microphone hovering inches from his lips. For the first time all night, he missed a beat. His eyes widened on the brim of his fedora. He heard it. Everyone heard it. The band, still locked into the rhythm, played on for a moment before faltering, uncertain. The drummer hesitated. The keys softened, and then the music thinned as each musician glanced toward Michael, waiting for his cue. But he wasn't giving one. He was standing absolutely still, staring out into the sea of faces when the expression of cameras caught instantly and magnified on the giant screens above. It wasn't confusion. It was something deeper. Recognition. The audience felt it too. The cheering died down to murmurs, then to silence. 50,000 people, holding their breath. The air shifted, fragile, heavy, and then it came again, louder this time, trembling but insistent. Michael. He lifted a hand to shade his eyes from the blinding spotlight and peered into the front rows. Somewhere near the barricade, a child was standing on a seat, small arms waving weakly, a voice breaking from his throat with everything he had left. The boy couldn't have been more than 8. His frame was thin, his face pale beneath the harsh lights. An oversized tour T-shirt hung on his tiny body, and around his wrist glinted a white hospital bracelet. stark and jarring in the spectacle of sequins and floodlights. His mother clutched him protectively, tears streaming down her face, whispering something in his ear as though to calm him. But he kept calling, louder, louder, refusing to be swallowed by the silence of 50,000 strangers. Michael's throat tightened. His chest rose and fell with a sudden shudder. For a moment, the king of pop, the global icon who had faced cameras, critics, and crowds larger than some cities, looked as fragile as the boy who had just called his name. He stepped forward, his shoes whispering against the stage floor, eyes locked on the child. The microphone dipped in his hand, his voice suddenly soft, trembling. "What's your name, little man?" The words echoed across the arena, amplified by a sound system now carrying something far more intimate than a lyric. The crowd leaned in, as though 50,000 people might somehow catch the answer of a single child. The boy cupped his hands to his mouth, took a breath, and shouted again. And in that instant, Michael Jackson, the man who had moonwalked across the world, froze in place, tears glistening in his eyes, a smile breaking through even as his lips trembled. The song had stopped. The show had stopped. The night, history itself, had shifted. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. For a long, breathless moment, the world seemed to stop spinning. Michael stood at the edge of the stage, one hand gripping the microphone, the other trembling slightly at his side. His heart was hammering harder than the bass drums that had powered through the arena minutes before. The sound of the crowd had thinned to whispers, a confused murmur of 50,000 people trying to make sense of what they were seeing. But for Michael, it wasn't 50,000 anymore. It was one. That boy. The camera zoomed in, the giant screens above the stage flickering as they found him in the crowd. The sight made a hush ripple through the audience like a cold wind sweeping across a field. There he was, a boy no older than 8, standing unsteadily on his seat, his mother's arm locked tight around his waist, as though afraid he'd collapse. His cheeks were pale, his lips almost colorless, and yet his eyes, enormous, bright, burning, were locked on Michael with a desperation that pierced deeper than any spotlight. The boy's hand shook as he raised it, waving, calling again. His small voice cracked, breaking into sobs even as he tried to shout. "Michael, Michael." Michael swallowed hard, the lump in his throat refusing to move. He lowered himself to a crouch at the edge of the stage, peering past the blinding floodlights, past the front rows, past the sea of security guards who now exchanged nervous glances. His voice, when it came, was not the practiced tone of a performer. It was stripped bare, raw. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The boy's mother was crying openly now. She leaned close to her son, urging him on, whispering in his ear. The boy inhaled shakily, then shouted with all the strength left in his fragile frame. "David." The name echoed to the speakers, carried by the sensitive microphones positioned along the stage. The crowd gasped as one, not just at the name, but at the way Michael reacted to it. His head tilted back, his eyes wet. A trembling smile broke across his face, as at the sound of that single word, David, carried a weight only he could feel. David. Michael repeated softly into the microphone, his voice catching on the syllables. "That's a strong name, a beautiful name." The arena went silent again, the tension straining at the very edges of the air. Michael's gloved hand rose, gesturing gently toward the family, beckoning them closer. But the security guards hesitated. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't part of the polished, choreographed, minute-perfect show that had been rehearsed for months. One of them leaned toward Michael, gesturing with a shake of his head. Michael ignored him. "Bring him forward," he said quietly, then firmer. "Bring the boy to me." The command carried weight. It wasn't a request. The crowd, realizing what was happening, began to murmur louder. Some gasped, some cheered, others covered their mouths with their hands, overwhelmed. The mother was frozen, clutching her son tightly, not daring to believe it. One of the guards approached her, speaking quickly, pointing toward the stage. She shook her head at first, then looked down at David, who nodded weakly, his face lit with something that resembled joy even through the exhaustion. And then it began, slowly, carefully. The guards lifted the child from his seat, guiding his mother and father along as they made their way down the aisle. The audience parted instinctively, whispering, pointing, craning their necks to watch. On stage, Michael paced like a man trying to contain an ocean inside his chest. He covered his mouth with his hand, eyes never leaving David as he drew closer. The band stood frozen at their instruments, their eyes wide. Even the stagehands and wings were still, their earpieces buzzing with questions that no one dared answer. When the family reached the barricade, the guards lifted David gently over it. His mother followed, clutching his small hand the entire time, her tears glistening in the glare of the spotlights. The boy's father trailed close, looking both terrified and overwhelmed. The crowd was no longer an audience. It was a witness. An entire stadium had shifted from entertainment to reverence. Every camera, every eye, every breath was fixed on the fragile boy being carried toward Michael Jackson. Michael crouched again, his sequin jacket catching the light like fire as he extended his arms. When David was finally set down at the edge of the stage, too weak to climb, Michael knelt lower and scooped him gently into his arms. The arena erupted, but not in screams. It was applause, yes, but soft, reverent, almost prayerful. The sound of 50,000 people crying and clapping all at once. Michael held David close, cradling him as if he were made of glass. He whispered into the boy's ear, though the microphone still picked up fragments, "You're so brave, so strong." David smiled weakly, his voice trembling as he spoke into the microphone still in Michael's hand. "I love you, Michael." The words hit like thunder. The crowd gasped and broke into sobs. Strangers embraced. Grown men wept openly. Mothers clutched their children. Michael closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against David's. His lips quivered, his voice breaking as he whispered back, "I love you more." The moment stretched, suspended in air, as though time itself was afraid to intrude. For Michael, the music, the choreography, the dazzling spectacle, all of it dissolved. What remained was this child, this tiny voice that had stopped the world in its tracks. The tears that streaked Michael's face were not for performance. They were real. They burned hot and unstoppable, flowing freely down his cheeks even as he smiled through them. He lifted his head at last, turning back to the microphone. His voice trembled, thick with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, barely audible at first, then stronger, This is why I do what I do. This boy is the reason." The audience exploded, not in wild cheers, but in a wave of applause so heartfelt it shook the air. It wasn't fandom anymore. It was love. Michael hugged David closer, kissing his forehead. He looked out into the sea of faces, 50,000 pairs of eyes reflecting his own tears, and he knew the concert was no longer his. It belonged to David now. The roar of applause still echoed, but Michael wasn't hearing it anymore. He was hearing his own heartbeat. He was hearing the trembling breaths of the boy in his arms. He was hearing the voice that had cut through 50,000 others just to reach him. The band, still frozen behind him, exchanged anxious looks. The drummer hovered his sticks above the kit, unsure whether to continue. The keyboard player's fingers lingered on the keys, waiting for a signal that never came. Stage managers in the wings whispered furiously into their headsets. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Michael looked up, scanning the endless crowd, his tear-streaked face now blown up 30 feet high on the Jumbotron. His sequin jacket shimmered under the spotlights, but it wasn't the spectacle the audience saw anymore. It was the vulnerability. And then he raised his free hand. The band understood instantly. One by one, the instruments fell silent. The guitars faded. The drums hushed. The bass melted into nothing. The arena plunged into a silence so profound it was almost frightening. 50,000 people holding their breath. Michael brought the microphone to his lips, his voice quiet, cracked but unmistakable. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need you to understand something." The words rolled across the stadium, steady despite the tremor in his throat. He shifted David carefully in his arms, holding him close against his chest, the child's head resting against his shoulder. "We came here tonight for music, for dance, for joy." But sometimes he stopped, choking back the emotion. His gloved hand wiped at his face, catching fresh tears glistening under the lights. Sometimes something bigger than the show walks right into your life. The arena was so quiet now, the silence almost rang in people's ears. From the farthest rows to the floor seats pressed against the barricade, every eye was fixed on the stage. Michael turned his head, his eyes finding David's mother and father, who stood at the side of the stage, trembling, tears running freely. He nodded to them, then back at the boy. "This little one here," Michael said softly. "His name is David, and he is stronger than all of us tonight." The crowd erupted in applause, thunderous but reverent. People shot to their feet, clapping, crying, holding their children tighter. Michael's voice grew firmer now, the performer giving way to something deeper. "I've sung in front of millions of people. I've danced on stages all over the world. But tonight," he pressed his forehead gently against David's hair, "tonight, this boy is the reason we're here." The ovation swelled, filling the space with love that seemed to vibrate in the very concrete walls. But Michael wasn't done. He lowered the mic, turned toward his band, and gave a single nod. They began to rise from their seats, confused, uncertain. He looked back at the audience, his voice rising with conviction. "So tonight, I'm stopping the show." The word struck like lightning. Gasps shot through the crowd. The managers in the wings nearly dropped their headsets. Stopping the show at the height of the concert? It was unthinkable. But Michael didn't hesitate. He turned back to the audience, clutching David tighter, as if shielding him from the weight of the world. His eyes burned with intensity, his voice powerful now, commanding. "Music is beautiful. But life," he paused, voice cracking again, "life is sacred. And tonight this life is more important than any song." The arena erupted again, but this time it wasn't wild hysteria. It was thunderous, emotional applause, the sound of 50,000 people acknowledging something extraordinary. People who had come to scream and dance were now weeping openly, clapping with trembling hands. Michael turned, gesturing to his crew, his voice sharp now. "Bring his family up, right now." Stagehands scrambled. Security moved with urgency. Within moments, David's mother and father were being escorted onto the stage, their faces streaked with tears, their bodies shaking with disbelief. The mother reached her hands out for her son, but Michael shook his head gently, smiling through tears. "Don't worry," he whispered to her across the microphone. "He's safe here." The cameras captured every second, broadcasting the moment to the screens. So even those in the very top rows could feel they were standing right there. Michael knelt down, setting David gently on a stool at center stage. He adjusted the boy's oversized T-shirt, brushed his damp hair back from his forehead, and crouched so they were eye level. He didn't care about the timing. He didn't care about the money. He didn't care about the schedule or the executives screaming into radios backstage. He cared about this boy. "What's your favorite song, David?" Michael asked softly, lifting the mic to the child's mouth. David looked up at him, lips trembling, his small voice faint but clear. "Heal the World." The word struck Michael like a blow. He covered his mouth, turning away as his body shook with sobs he couldn't hold back. When he faced David again, his eyes were red, his cheeks streaked, his lips trembling into a smile. "That's perfect," he whispered. "That's more than perfect." The crowd erupted into cries and applause again, and Michael raised a hand, silencing them with a single gesture. "Then that's what we'll do." For the first time in his career, Michael Jackson had stopped a concert at its peak. For the first time, the spectacle gave way to a single boy's request. 50,000 people were no longer an audience. They were witnesses to something sacred. And as the lights dimmed, narrowing to a single spotlight that fell on Michael and David at the center of the stage, history was about to be rewritten. The arena was wrapped in silence. Not the restless silence of impatience, not the hushed murmur of anticipation, but a sacred quiet, as if 50,000 people had agreed all at once to hold their breath. At the center of the stage sat a single stool. On it, David rested, small and frail, his legs dangling, his tiny hands gripping the edges as though the very weight of the stadium might sweep him away. His hospital bracelet gleamed under the lights, a jarring reminder of the reality that clashed so violently with the glittering world around him. And beside him, crouched low, one hand resting on the boy's shoulder, the other clutching a microphone, was Michael Jackson. The cameras magnified the scene on the giant screens above, but even without them, every person in the arena could feel it. They weren't watching the King of Pop anymore. They weren't watching the Moonwalker, the legend, the icon. They were watching a man, vulnerable, raw, stripped of every barrier fame had built around him. Michael's eyes glistened as he spoke into the mic, his voice trembling. David told me his favorite song is Heal the World. The crowd erupted into applause, but Michael quickly raised a hand. No, no, he whispered, smiling softly. Tonight, we're not going to cheer. Tonight, we're going to listen. We're going to feel. The applause died instantly. Michael turned back to David, brushing a strand of damp hair from the boy's forehead. His hand lingered there for a moment, fatherly, protective. Then he nodded at the band, who were poised with instruments in hand, waiting. Keep it soft, he murmured. Keep it gentle. This is for him. The first delicate notes floated into the air. A quiet piano line, slow and tender, filling the cavernous arena with fragility that made the silence even more profound. Michael lifted the microphone, but before he sang, he leaned close to David. The audience could see his lips move on the screen. This one's for you, little man. Then he began. Heal the world, make it a better place. The words trembled, not because his voice faltered, but because it carried a weight too heavy for even Michael to bear. His tone was softer than ever, every syllable drenched in emotion, every breath thick with unshed tears. The arena dissolved into stillness. Thousands of fans covered their mouths. Others clutched their hearts. People had screamed themselves hoarse minutes before were now whispering prayers under their breath, afraid to break the spell. Michael turned toward David, singing not to the crowd, not to the cameras, but directly to him. Their eyes locked, and the boy's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, weak but radiant. A spark of joy piercing through the exhaustion etched on his face. For you and for me, and the entire human race. Michael reached out, guiding the microphone toward David's lips. The boy hesitated, his chest rising and falling with effort. His mother, watching from the wings, pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. And then, with a voice fragile as glass but steady with courage, David sang, There are people dying. The sound was faint, almost swallowed by the vastness of the arena, but the microphones caught it, amplifying it, carrying it through the speakers until 50,000 people heard it clear. The crowd gasped. Some fell to their knees. Others simply broke, sobbing openly. Michael's face crumpled, tears streaming down his cheeks. He leaned in, their voices joined together in harmony. If you care enough for the living, make a better place for you and for me. The band swelled, but softly, respectfully, the instruments cushioning rather than overwhelming the fragile duet. The giant screens above captured the sight. The world's greatest performer kneeling beside a dying child, both singing with everything they had. Something shifted in the arena. It wasn't just a concert anymore. It wasn't even just a performance. It was collective prayer, a plea for life, a moment suspended outside of time. One by one, the audience began to join in. At first it was a murmur, a whisper of voices blending into the melody. But soon it grew, swelling into a soft chorus that filled every corner of the stadium. 50,000 voices singing, but not screaming, not shouting, singing gently, like a lullaby. Michael and David, side by side, led them. The cameras panned across the sea of faces. Teenagers with mascara running down their cheeks, fathers hugging their sons, mothers clutching daughters. Strangers embraced, united by something larger than themselves. The entire stadium was transformed into a single choir, carrying the song upward as if the heavens themselves might hear. Michael leaned closer to David, letting the boy's voice rise on its own, weak but unshakable. The child's small hand gripped Michael's, their fingers interlaced. Heal the world. Michael echoed him softly, his voice breaking. Make it a better place. And for one shimmering moment, it didn't matter who was famous, who was powerful, who was ordinary. It didn't matter that one of them was a global superstar and the other a child clinging to life. They were equals, two souls singing together against the inevitable, against the darkness. The song came to its final verse. The music thinned, leaving just the piano, Michael, and David. Michael's voice was barely more than a whisper, trembling with love as he carried the last words. For you and for me. The final note faded into silence. No one moved. No one dared. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder, a silence that pressed against chests and burned behind eyes. It was a silence of something holy. And then, softly at first, then growing, came the applause. But it wasn't the wild, shrieking applause of a pop concert. It was slow, deliberate, like waves rolling onto shore. A standing ovation not of hysteria, but of reverence. People weren't just clapping. They were weeping, their hands shaking, their hearts pounding. Michael pulled David into his arms, kissing the top of his head. His voice broke again as he whispered into the mic. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you met the bravest person I've ever known. The ovation swelled, thunderous now, tears and cheers blending into a single roar of love that shook the very air. And in the center of it all, Michael held David close, his tears falling freely, his smile shining through them. The superstar, the legend, the king of pop, undone by the smallest voice in the room. The ovation rolled to the arena like an ocean tide. It was unlike anything that had ever followed a Michael Jackson performance. No shrieking hysteria, no desperate cries of encore. Just the thunderous sound of 50,000 people clapping through their tears, united in reverence. Strangers held each other. Parents clutched children. The music had ended, but something far greater had been born. At the center of the stage, Michael stood, David cradled in his arms. The boy's small face was pressed against his chest, his eyes half closed, a faint smile curving his lips. The hospital bracelet gleamed under the lights, a fragile reminder of the battle being fought beneath the surface. Michael raised the microphone again, his voice trembling but resolute. This, he paused, his throat tightening. He swallowed hard, his tears shining under the spotlight. This is the real star tonight. Not me, not the band. This boy right here. The arena erupted again, not in wild screams, but in a standing ovation so powerful it shook the rafters. Michael turned slowly, allowing the cameras to capture the sight of David, holding him high as if presenting him to the world. His name is David, Michael said, his voice breaking, and he is stronger, braver, and more full of love than anyone I've ever met. Tonight we sang for him, and tonight he reminded us what this music is all about. The crowd cheered louder, but still, something in the air kept it reverent, sacred. Michael lowered David gently into his mother's arms. She clutched her son tight, tears streaming down her cheeks as she mouthed thank you over and over. The boy's father stood behind her, his hand pressed his mouth, overwhelmed beyond words. Michael crouched low, pressing his lips to David's forehead once more. He whispered something only the boy could hear. On the Jumbotron, the cameras caught the small flicker of David's smile, brighter than anything else in the stadium. The crowd roared again, sensing the intimacy of the moment, but respecting it all the same. When Michael stood, his entire body seemed transformed. He had walked onto the stage as the king of pop. Now he stood as something else, a man who had just laid bare his soul in front of the world. He raised the microphone again, his voice firmer now, laced with conviction. I want every one of you to remember tonight. Remember that music is not just about dancing. It's not just about screaming or lights or costumes. Music is about love. Music is about healing. Music is about moments like this. The crowd answered with a roar, many raising their lighters, some lifting their phones, thousands of tiny flames and lights flickering across the stadium like a galaxy come to life. Michael turned, looking back at David one more time. The boy waved weakly, his smile fragile but radiant. Michael pressed a hand to his heart, then pointed back at him. You healed us tonight, David. Thank you. The crowd lost it, crying and cheering at once, the emotion overwhelming. Michael turned back to the band, nodding. The music kicked up again, not the polished choreography, not the rigid set list they had rehearsed, but something raw, free, alive. The next songs were filled with a different kind of power. Every lyric carried new meaning. Every movement was infused with something beyond performance. He sang not for fame, not for the cameras, not even for crowd. He sang for David, for the boy who had reminded him, in the middle of glitter and smoke and spectacle, why it started singing in the first place. The rest of the concert became legendary. People described it later as a spiritual experience. Every song seemed drenched in new life. When Michael moonwalked, it wasn't just a dance step. It was a prayer in motion. When he belted out a note, it wasn't just music. It was a plea to the universe. And the audience knew they were witnessing something that would never happen again. When the final encore ended, Michael didn't leave in his usual way. No pyrotechnics, no dramatic fade to black. Instead, he walked slowly to the edge of the stage, bowing low, his tears still fresh, his chest heaving with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered into the mic, barely audible but carried across the stadium. "Thank you for loving him with me tonight." He waved one last time to David and his family, who were still at the side of the stage, and then he stepped into the shadows. The lights came up, but no one moved. For long minutes, 50,000 people stood there, unable to break the spell. Parents hugged their children tighter. Friends embraced. Grown men sobbed into their hands. It wasn't just a concert they had attended. It was a memory seared into their souls. The legacy. In the days that followed, word of the concert spread like wildfire. Newspapers didn't just review the music. They reported on the moment the superstar stopped everything for a child. Headlines read, "Michael Jackson stops concert for dying boy," and "A night of tears and healing at the stadium." Bootleg recordings surfaced, shaky and grainy but treasured. Fans passed them around, not because of the songs, but because of the silence, the child's voice, the trembling words Michael spoke into the mic. For those who had been there, it was impossible to describe. They tried anyway. It felt like church, some said. It felt like God was in the room, said others. Many described it as the most human moment they had ever witnessed from a man, so often larger than life. And for David, the boy who had shouted his name, something extraordinary happened. His parents later told reporters that their son had been given only weeks to live. But after that night, something changed. He held on, for months longer than anyone expected. Months filled with memories, laughter, and the peace of knowing he had stood on a stage with his hero, and the world had loved him for it. Michael, too, was changed. Those close to him said he carried the memory of that night like a flame inside him. He spoke often about David, about the way one child's voice had stopped him in his tracks. His concerts, already famous, took on new layers of compassion. He began noticing faces in the crowd more, reaching out to fans in ways he hadn't before. But nothing ever matched that night. The memory. Years later, fans still talked about it. They still cried when they remembered. For those 50,000 who were in the arena, it wasn't just a story. It was etched into their bones. Ask them, and they'll tell you the same thing. It wasn't the moonwalk. It wasn't the pyrotechnics. It wasn't the spectacle. It was the moment a child shouted Michael Jackson's name, and the king of pop froze, smiled through tears, and turned an entire concert into something eternal. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.